Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our second Caring for Vulnerable Children Google Hangout, coming to you live from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. Today, we will be putting your questions to Graeme McPheet, as well as reviewing the course content so far. Please feel free to ask questions using the Google Hangout question bar, and we will do our best to pass along as many of your questions as we can. You can also post your questions using Twitter. Please use the hashtag FLChildren. And now, without further ado, I will hand you over to our host today, Graeme McPheet.
Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining me on this Google Hangout today, both to those that are joining us and watching us live, and also if you're watching the recording at a later date. I'll start by, for those that were with us for the Google Hangout 2 weeks ago, you'll notice an obvious difference. My sidekick, John Paul, is not with me, sadly. He's unwell and is in bed, so if you're managing to tune in, John Paul, hope you're doing okay, and if you get any awkward questions, you can send them in and I shall duly ignore them. But as for everybody else, as Aidan said in the introduction, it would be really good to get contributions and get some conversations going about some of the things I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. There's two ways in which you can do that. One is via the Google Hangout page. If you put your questions in there, they should get passed on to me, and also on our Twitter account. So that's hashtag FLChildren, all one word. And again, that should come through to me. Again, I should probably apologise in advance. Again, for those that have watched these Google Hangouts before, John Paul's very much the iPad and the Apple man. He normally sits with the iPad in front of him and kind of works everything. So not only am I flying solo, I'm trying to navigate the iPad. So if anything goes wrong and you see a hand or a voice from afar, that's Aidan helping me sort out the iPad. Just want to start by kind of saying thank you to everybody for the great participation and contributions we've had on the course so far. This is us coming up to the end of week 4, so we're nearly 2/3 of the way through, and both the number and quality of contributions has been fantastic. Some really good discussions going on. We've had over 25,000 comments just about now kind of posted across the 4 weeks. Over 100,000 steps have been completed, big participation numbers, so kind of lots of kind of good conversations going on, and I'm sure that will continue for the remaining 2 weeks of the course, but I would like to stimulate a bit more discussion today. So what I'm going to try and do today is I've got a note of a number of questions that have been posted for the Google Hangout this week, but as well as that, I've pulled off some comments people have posted and some of the different discussions in response to some of the topics that we've been thinking about this week, and it gives me the chance to kind of sit and kind of offer my take on a couple of things that we've been speaking about, and just hopefully further the discussion. Also kind of take the opportunity to say, especially to the people that are not watching this live but are kind of watching it at a later date, that there really is the opportunity to keep the conversation going here. So if you're watching it after the fact on the Google Hangout page, you can go to scroll down to the bottom and make comments and keep the conversation going. And I'll make a point of looking closely at that conversation in that page, and it would be really good to hear some people's different views on some of the topics that I'm going to be speaking about today. As a way into kind of the questions and the comments that have been made, one of the things you would have seen this week was myself, one of the video inputs at the beginning of the week, talking about different traditions of childcare practice and thinking about child and youth care, social pedagogy, youth work, residential childcare, and about how those traditions do or don't link to social work. And I finished that talk by highlighting 4 kind of issues or areas and saying that these were perhaps challenges or things for us to think about as we move forward with the task of caring for vulnerable children. The first one I spoke about was the the issue of challenging risk aversion, and that was a theme that was expanded on further on in the learning objects by the discussion and input from Dr. Ian Milligan, and that got a real good response, so we'll be touching on some of the things there. I highlighted the use of activities and how we can use activities to build resilience. And again, that's partly linked into what Ian was talking about in relation to risk aversion, so we'll touch on that. And I also spoke about relationships and how we make young people feel cared for and loved. And I think that the learning object or the input that bore the biggest connection to that this week was the discussion, the interview with Jenny Malloy, which got a lot of comments and a big response. So we're going to comment on that today as well. So if you are watching live and you can connect with us, anything around about challenging risk aversion, use of activities, building resilience, relationships, care, love, etc., then kind of feel free to contact us with either direct questions or comments and just your thoughts and views about any of this. So I'm less high tech than John Paul. I've got lots of bits of paper here, so as I go through. So we have had some questions sent in advance, so I'm going to respond to some of those in the first instance. And the first question that I'm going to respond to was posted by Lindsay Fraser. So Lindsay, thanks very much for posting your question, and actually also Olivia Mifflin, who responded to Lindsay's question and kind of kept the discussion going. So thanks to Lindsay and Olivia for this post. And Lindsay was commenting, kind of pulling a few of the strands together from this week, and asked a question that linked into Billy's story. Now, obviously, Billy's story has got to a certain point. You've seen it up to the end of kind of week 4 now, and from a lot of comments, a lot of people are kind of curious and actually kind of quite anxious in many ways about what's going to happen to Billy as his story progresses. And Lindsay asked a question about the fact that given our story of Billy is based in Scotland, here in the UK, and we know that the financial and political climate here is one of budget cuts and a lot of service closures. And Lindsay asked a question about what implications and what risks that this financial climate and the closure of services and the cutting of resources faces, or what risks that presents for organisations, but more particularly families such as Billy, and kind of how Billy and his family kind of respond to this. And I'm going to offer some views on this. I'm going to try my best not to get kind of up on my pedestal and go off on a political rant here, but there obviously is a kind of political dimension to this discussion, because certainly in a Scottish and a UK context, we know we are living through a time of budget cuts both for local authority statutory services, but also for the third sector, charitable voluntary organisations finding it more difficult to secure funding. And we know at times of budget cuts, then charitable donations from the public can often reduce as well. So we end up in a bit of a never decreasing circle. And Lindsay asking the question about kind of what impact does this have? Well, I guess there's a certain argument, and there would appear to be figures to suggest it, which would say that the current situation we are in the UK just now, we are seeing more vulnerable children and families placed in more difficult circumstances as their income is reduced, and the services that might have been put in place to support some of these most vulnerable families are cut. So in effect, it's almost like a double whammy. Kind of some families find themselves with less resources to survive for themselves, but equally there's less supports out there in terms of how we respond to them. Now, Lindsay makes the point that when we're having budget cuts, it has a detrimental impact on staffing levels, staff training and resources that we can make available to vulnerable families. And she says if this support is to continue and provided, it may have to be carried out by volunteers. She says, my view is that provided there are enough suitable people willing to volunteer, then this may be the only way forward at this time. Now, that's an interesting question. Well, it's an interesting thought in terms of the fact that does that remove some of the responsibility from the state? Now, there's a strong argument to be made that if whilst we wouldn't be wanting stopping people volunteering for and playing the part that they can in communities or in organisations in terms of supporting both families and individuals, there is an argument to say that the more individuals within communities step up to the mark, does that somehow excuse the state and say, well, we don't need to be providing the resources because the community does it for itself? And Olivia Mifflin says she followed in this, and she doesn't say, and she says she's in the Midlands, so assuming this is in the Midlands in England and the UK, and she says, I'm interested in funding issues too. She says, where we are in the Midlands, they're cutting social worker posts as well as support worker posts, and there's a lot less money in the budget for this sector. Long-term family support of this kind would have been my chosen work role, and whilst I would love to do things on a voluntary basis, I always can't. And I think there's an issue here about the kind of only so many people can give so much of their time to support families and individuals and communities when they experience need. And I guess the question I would like to put back out is to people to think about is, where should that dividing line be in terms of what role and what responsibility does the state have to care for the most vulnerable and needy members of society, and how much is it acceptable to rely on individual volunteers or voluntary organisations? And there's a fairly kind of well-known phrase which goes along the lines of, if you want to get a sense of any society, then take a look at how it treats its most vulnerable members, and that will give you a sense of the values that drive that society. So there's an interesting question there about what the role of the state should be in relation to kind of caring for vulnerable children. I'm also very aware that I'm kind of answering this question in a UK-Scottish context. We've got lots of participants from outside the UK, and I would be interested to hear if we could have any conversations about are these debates being replayed in different parts of the world? Is this theme of austerity or budget cuts, is that one that plays out in different places? Is there a discussion, or is there any concern about what the role of the state should be and what the role of the community and individuals should be in terms of supporting that? So it would be really nice to get some discussion going on the page in terms of people's different views and responses to that. So Lindsay and Olivia, thanks very much for your questions. Going off in a bit of a different direction, Elaine Webster. Elaine, thanks for posting your question. And she asked a question in relation to resilience building and risk competence. That was obviously one of the themes of the week, and certainly Dr. Ian Milligan's discussion about the building risk competence versus risk aversion and how we manage that. And Elaine's got a specific question about, wanted to ask about the role of peers in building resilience and building risk competence in vulnerable children. And she said that can group pressures help or complicate matters? And perhaps the answer to that is both. Now, a lot of the research and a lot of the literature round about resilience and round about growth and development would emphasise strongly the important role that strong friendships and strong peer relationships can play for young people as they grow and develop. So certainly peer support and peer relationships can be an important plank in that growth and development and resilience building. But perhaps it gets slightly more complicated when what happens when either your children or children that you're responsible for looking after, they begin to access peer support and peer relationships with individuals or groups where there's an assessment that that's taking either them or their behaviour in a direction that's less than helpful. Because lots of young people gain strength, gain identity, gain a sense of who they are via their peer relationships and the groups that they're part of. But there may also be lots of adults around about that offering judgments on whether that is effectively a good bunch of people for them to be having contact with or not. So the answer can be, well, yes, in some circumstances it can be a really positive step. In others, the picture may be a bit more mixed, and there can be some interesting discussions about, especially when young people get a strong sense of identity from being part of a group or being part of behaviours that in other instances might be frowned on, but nonetheless there are lots of positives for the young person being involved in that process. So that presents a really tricky and challenging situation for the adults involved in caring for those young people and responding to them, because it's, well, I can recognise the positive elements of it, even if there are some kind of problematic issues associated with it. So what's the best way to respond there? Now, and my guess is there'll be lots of people doing the course who've been involved in caring for and working with lots of young people who have began to gain strength and growth and development via being involved in some kind of groups and peer situations that kind of might be assessed to have both kind of positive and negative spin-offs. So again, I would be interested to hear about people's different experiences of that and people's different views of that. And actually, I mentioned there about there'll be people who've been involved in working with children. There'll be many out there who'll be parents who will have experienced this in relation to your own children, in terms of the people in their community that you feel happy or less happy about them becoming friends with and forming relations with, and the different implications that can have. So Elaine, thanks very much for your question. I hope it's answered it of a sort. I'd be interested to hear what you think. Come back on the comment page. Another question here from Alec. I think it's Tob or Tab. I'm not 100% sure how I pronounce it, so I'm going to say it both ways, Alex, and hope that covers it. Is that Tab or Tob? And Alex asked the question, could you please address the different types of residential care in Scotland? Here in the States, that being the US, we have group homes for vulnerable children and special needs children. We also have some residential homes for juveniles in our juvenile justice system. Do you have different types and how do they function? Well, I'm going to answer this, and I'm not going to answer this, Alex. And my answer is going to be, if you can wait another couple of days, when we move on to week 5, when that material becomes available on Monday, we have some more in-depth material on residential childcare. We looked at it in more detail. So rather than me talk about it too much just now, I'll say that as of Monday, we'll have a bit more material about that. And I'd be interested on the forum posts, Alec, to hear from you and about what your reaction to the material that's presented. Very short answer is we do have different types of residential provision for children in different situations. And actually the whole nature of the organisation of residential childcare and what it looks like has changed quite significantly in Scotland and the UK over the last 20 or 30 years. And if you are interested in reading more about it, Alex, I've kind of brought a book here, Rethinking Residential Childcare, Positive Perspectives by Mark Smith. If you're interested in the history and development of residential childcare in Scotland, and I was going to recommend one book, this would be the one for you to look at. But there'll be much more material in that next week and some link out to other material. So thanks very much for the question, Alex. We move on to another question, again on a completely different tangent. Got a question from Christine Fantham, and it was also repeated by Tatiana Calvex. I hope I'm getting the pronunciations correct there for Christine and Tatiana. And Christine asked a quick question about the exam that participants can take at the end of the 6-week course. Now we're 2/3 of the way through it. People might be thinking more about that. And she asked the question, please could you give us some details about the format and any revision advice? 2 quick answers. One is the format is multiple choice, so in a way quite familiar to you via the end of the week quizzes that you've been doing. And secondly, in relation to revision advice, all the exam questions focus on material that has been covered in the course, so there's no need to go elsewhere to think about revising. So I hope that answers your question, Christine and Tatiana. And again, if you get any other information that you would like, please come back on the discussion and leave me a reply, and I'll do my best to answer you. Right, I'm going to jump to, I'm going to move to kind of one of the themes that we had said at the beginning that I posted in the discussion. Please excuse me whilst I find my pieces of paper here again. This is where the absence of John Paul jumped through. The theme of love and care and Jenny Molloy. And Jenny's input generated a huge response from people, and I've had the pleasure of watching and listening to Jenny talk live at a conference. I've read some of her material, her books and other stuff, and then obviously what we used in the course was I guess a discussion, an interview that I had with Jenny. And when we were devising this course, we were really keen to get an input from Jenny, because I think Jenny has got a lot of really important and really insightful things to say about how we think about caring for vulnerable children, and especially those children that end up not being able to live at home with their birth families and end up in the care system, however the care system is constructed in the country that you live in, and in the UK, thinking predominantly about residential childcare and foster care. And if you haven't already, I would really encourage people to go onto the page with the interview with Jenny and have a listen to it, and then scroll down to the bottom and read through some of the comments and the responses that have been left for Jenny, and kind of lots of kind of very positive comments about what Jenny had to say about young people feeling loved for and cared for, and how that is so important for all children, but perhaps especially so for children that have experienced trauma, loss, separation, potentially abuse, and thus have issues with self-esteem, have issues with the kind of growth and development and resilience, and a lot of the other things that we've been speaking about. And so many comments, and I've picked out a few. I've got one here from Alex Hutchison, talks about Jenny Molloy's interview was excellent in every way. And he makes the point, looked after children need to feel loved, where they will develop, feel wanted and grow in confidence. Josie Maniscalco, again, Josie, I hope I've got your name correct there. She was speaking about the passion and the commitment and about kind of giving love. And it's interesting, what we called that step, I think the step is actually, remember, it's just called love. And it's interesting that being involved, myself, my experience of having worked in residential childcare for a number of years, and now working in the university sector, but working with a lot of students and practitioners from residential childcare services, and how freely people are able or feel able to use the word love, because for a long time, I think it would be fair to say that a number of practitioners would have felt hesitant or slow about talking about loving the children that they were working with. And I can a lot of reasons behind that, and some of them we will perhaps touch on next week when we think about residential childcare in Scotland. But some of it kind of tied up with this notion that if we talk about loving children, that we're working with, are we in some way being unprofessional? Because, and Jenny touched on this notion of being professional is that there's me as a professional and there's the child, and we've got some sort of distance and some sort of boundary between us. And Jenny was able to kind of talk about so well about how her own experience of needing to be claimed, needing to feel cared, needing to be loved. And I think if there's lots of things that Jenny's got to say that I think we should be paying attention to, but if there's one thing, that need for care and love. And alongside that, there was a common theme in a number of the comments that were left under Jenny's interview, and that was about the quote that was attributed to Yuri Bronfenbrenner. Now, we introduced Yuri Bronfenbrenner in week 2. It was Laura Steckley mentioned Yuri Bronfenbrenner talking about the ecological model of assessment, and his name came up again this week in relation to the quote, "Every kid needs at least one adult who is crazy about him or her." And the number of participants that have re-quoted that in their comments, I found that Josie, who I mentioned, Alex, who I mentioned, Marie Hood also mentioned it as well. I was struck by Bronfenbrenner's statement that every child needs at least one adult who is crazy about him or her, and that seems to have really struck a chord with a number of you about how it is so important that the services that we construct for vulnerable children and young people, however we do it, we have got to absolutely ensure that the children and young people know that there's people out there for them who have got their interests absolutely at heart and will do whatever it takes to make sure that they're cared for and looked after, and that young people feel claimed, they feel cared for, they feel loved. And I would hope that via the work of Jenny, via the discussions we're having in this course, and via some things that are going on elsewhere, I would like to think that within the care system, within residential childcare, we can perhaps reclaim the word love and actually more readily talk about how it'll be fine to talk about loving the children that we work with without that being questioned or being seen as unprofessional in any way. Again, I would like to hear people's views on that, because whilst there was lots of discussion round about Jenny and her input, perhaps less so about the specific use of the word love. So what are your views and thoughts about that? The second last thing I'd like to speak about, we had that was a really enjoyable input from Dr. Ian Milligan talking about risk and how we guard against risk aversion, and again that seemed to strike a chord with a number of people, just judging by the comments that were left at the bottom of his page. I've kind of pulled out one here from Audrey Gordon. Audrey, thanks for your contribution, and I'm not going to read out your whole contribution. It was the first sentence that jumped out at me. In today's professional climate, it is still difficult to escape the bonds of policy and procedure, and that's in many ways that's the issue in a nutshell that we're talking about here. And I think there's many practitioners often feel frustrated by policies and procedures that are put forward as supposedly being in the best interests of the children and young people that we're looking after. But I think actually when you begin to analyse them in a bit more detail, it's highly possible to make the argument that these policies are actually more about the organisations looking after themselves. And when especially if these policies and procedures act as some sort of barrier to young people being involved in activities which helps them to develop risk competence, and linking that to some of the material this week, we introduced you to the concept, the approach of social pedagogy, and I mentioned in my input that one of the reasons which social pedagogy has begun to gain a bit of traction in Scotland and the UK is that it offers a bit of a different take and a bit of a different view in relation to risk, and it encourages us more to think about risk competence rather than the management of risk and the avoidance of risk. Because if all we do is stop young people experiencing risky situations, then they in turn never learn to manage risky situations. And actually, we could argue further down the line, we actually place them more at risk because they haven't developed these kind of coping mechanisms for themselves. And so social pedagogy has a very strong flavour of that notion of risk competence. And one of the link outs to a document that you could access via the course this week via one of the pages, it's a nice document from Tempera, social pedagogy, and some of you may have looked at it already, and it's a picture of a young boy. I think the young boy's about kind of 4 or 5. He's standing on a plank which is over some water, and he's standing with a saw, and he started sawing the plank beneath his feet. And often when we're doing work with students and practitioners, we'll show them that picture and say, right, give us your immediate reaction to that. And it's not uncommon for lots of people to go, oh my goodness, kind of what's going to happen? He's going to saw through the plank and he's going to fall in the water, and it's going to be doom and disaster. And I'm not for a second suggesting that we should let young people just do whatever they want, whenever they want. But what social pedagogy would encourage us to think about is, well, there can be different ways to look at this in terms of, and if we're going to assess that situation, we need to have a bit of knowledge about the young person. But we need to know some sort of like kind of how deep's the water. Is this the first time he's had a saw in his hand, or does he get the opportunity to play with things like this kind of quite a lot? And as we begin, and to a sense of kind of what's the worst that could happen in the situation? Are there any adults nearby? We see the picture and just what's framed, so kind of what's round about, and how might we use these sorts of activities to think about children and young people developing risk competence. It's not uncommon, certainly in nursery schools in Scotland, for very young children, young people, for there to be alongside all the normal toys and sand and water, for them to get access to hammers and saws and such like things like that. And might this be just another example of how we encourage young people to encounter the world round about them in a way that helps them to develop risk competence? So again, I'd be interested to hear your views in relation to kind of how we develop risk competence, and wherever you are, in whatever country, in whatever organisation. Do you have a feeling that there's some risk aversion on behalf of society or organisations, or do we have a more healthy approach to risk competence? Finally, Billy's story. I said at the beginning that getting lots of comments and lots of forums, especially about Billy. Lots of people very invested in Billy and what is going on. I guess what I'd like to kind of flag up is a couple of things. One is that as the story goes on, you will get the chance at the end of week 5 to offer your views on what you think might be best to happen for Billy and his mum as we come towards the end of the story. It's not necessarily it's the end of the story as far as we will follow it with Billy and his family, but as we'll cover at the end of week 6, whilst we leave Billy and his mum at that point, that the story will continue for Billy and his mum in all likelihood, and thinking about how that links to other children and young people in society. But next week, one of the main focuses of week 5 is the Scottish Children's Hearing System, and you'll find out and hear a bit more about that. Many of you will already have some involvement and familiarity with the Scottish Children's Hearing System. For some of you, especially those from outside Scotland, this might be your first exposure to it. And in Billy's story this week, Billy ends up going to a hearing. I want to just take this opportunity to kind of flag up that the format is the same. The story, the video that you'll watch this week is about 3 or 4 minutes long. A children's hearing will always last longer than that. So what we've not tried to recreate is a whole children's hearing. So there might be some things that would and wouldn't happen that we've not shown on camera, or just giving you a taste of the hearing system and kind of giving you an introduction to it and some material to read and find out some more some more material. The overwhelming message amongst the posts that have been made about Billy's story today are people feeling very concerned for Billy, glad that he's getting some support from his youth worker and also from the teacher at school who he's formed a relationship with, but an increasing amount of concern about the ability of his mum to provide him with the appropriate care that's required. And actually linking this right back to the question back at the beginning about resources and finances, because there's some posts from people saying Billy's mum needs a service, Billy, this should be happening, that should be happening in terms of supports. And perhaps I guess the sad fact is that whilst Billy's story is fictional and made up, that there are lots of kind of Billys and their families out there, and what's going on for Billy and his family just now would be unlikely to trigger any sort of major response or input from statutory services because things have not got problematic enough, and there's a number of comments being made by people about, my goodness, do we need to wait till something goes really wrong before a response is put in, and is that too late? And I think that's a really important question, perhaps not the most cheery point to end on, but one that I would kind of put out to people in terms of kind of linking what's going on in Billy's story to the earlier theme of kind of what should the role of the state be in terms of caring for and responding to vulnerable children. But we've got to the end of it. I've surprised myself. I thought this was going to be a shorter session because I said previously that somebody may have to help me with the. Here we go. All right. So right. I've got a number of responses here, sorry, and so I'm going to make a point of kind of jumping in here, so I hadn't pressed the button to refresh it, so we're doing okay. So Kathy Toff, why do we always separate the problems of vulnerable children and vulnerable adults, as if there was a clear-cut barrier somewhere between childhood and adulthood? That's a good question, Kathy. I think possibly the younger children are the perhaps more of a distinction that we can make, but certainly the older, as children become kind of young people and young adults, then there's a strong argument to say that. I think it'd be fair to say that society often takes a different view towards children and adults. Adults have got more of a sense of being seen to kind of care for themselves, whereas children are often more seen as needing society or adults or organisations to intervene. So perhaps that's one of the that's one of the responses there. I'm just realising that one of the other way, by doing this on my own, normally I've got John Paul to vet the questions for me, whereas I'm reading them out here and then I'm putting myself right on the spot. Christina Suckling. Christina, thanks for contacting us. Can you tell me where social pedagogy is practiced in the UK? I've not heard about it practiced before and I find it very interesting. Well, there's a number of children's organisations, residential childcare providers and particular organisations who are taking a kind of an interest in social pedagogy. And actually, we're in the point in Scotland of residential childcare, the workforce being required to be qualified to degree status. This is a kind of process that's ongoing, and this will become a legal requirement and regulation at some point in the near future. And it's likely that a number of the degrees that will be developed to allow residential childcare workers will be social pedagogy based degrees. There's a social pedagogy degree which already exists at Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, and there's a number of other social pedagogy courses elsewhere in the UK. I mentioned Tempra social pedagogy, and they're involved in providing training and consultation on social pedagogy to a whole range of childcare organisations. And possibly the Tempra website would be and the link out from that is available in some of the materials this week. That would be the best place to go, Christina. So thanks for your question. And Susanna Pickles, kind of picking up on this kind of political funding theme, and so kind of talking about in a UK context, that we had the policy that was floated at the start of the last coalition government of the big society, and talking about there was this notion that society would step into the breach and provide the responses and support that was required. But as Susan makes the point, in the third sector, we've already got millions kind of volunteering, that there's only a limit perhaps to what kind of voluntary organisations and individual volunteers can do. And again, I think it really raises significant questions about where should the state be stepping in. And there's a lot of political debate in the UK going on just now saying that the state should be doing far more and be far more proactive in terms of, well, especially in terms of providing the funding so that services can be delivered to those most that need. So thanks very much to the people that have responded. I realise there's some others, but we have kind of come to the end of our time now. Alex and Mike, who I see some other responses here from, I will make a point of going into the Aidan will tell me later where I can access these, and I'll make a point of replying to them. So thanks for your questions. I just like to say kind of thank you to everybody who, if you've watched live, excellent, and especially the people that have sent in questions as we've been going. Secondly, if you're watching on the repeat, so be it. Please remember that the conversations can keep going at the bottom of the forum. I hope you enjoy week 5, and I will see you for our final Google Hangout, which will come at the end of week 6. And joining me for that Google Hangout, health considerations notwithstanding, will be Dr. Laura Steckley, who you met in week 2. But until then, thanks.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you to everybody who tuned in and sent us your questions today. We hope you're enjoying the course, and we welcome any feedback you have. You can always use Twitter or use the feedback step at the end of each week. The next Google Hangout will take place in week 6. From all of us here in Glasgow, thank you and goodbye.